Hey, welcome back, everybody. We'll try to make it through an uninterrupted half hour or 40 minutes or so of LAL today without tech issues, but no promises. I'm still stuck up in northern Vermont where it continues to snow, and I'm starting to think I didn't plan well enough for the winter. Didn't put the winter tires on the truck. It's stuck. My plow is in the shop, so I'm working on my trying to get up I call it a driveway. It's about a half a mile lane. It's pretty steep. Had trouble getting back up it with the tractor yesterday, and I'm thinking, will the heating oil guy get here? So I should probably get out of northern Vermont while I can still move and take my act back to southern Connecticut. But I like it up north. I like it where it's cold. So lots going on in the world, and I want to float the following hypothesis. What we're seeing in Western Europe and the United States is a slow drip version of Jean Raspail's Camp of the Saints. And I know I've talked about this book a lot, and I encourage all of you to read it. I don't view it as a xenophobic, anti-Western, or a xenophobic piece of literature that is anti-immigrant. I view it as a piece of realism about the strains that any ecosystem can undergo, including a social political ecosystem, a culture. The plot line in Camp of the Saints is as follows. In Southeast Asia, a group of migrants gets on a flotilla of ships destined for southern France. Southern French intellectuals and AKA the government and good right-thinking people everywhere have to decide what to do about it. They can't accommodate several million people arriving at once on their shores. And so they debate, what shall we do? On the one hand, we have ideals of openness and inclusion and the notion that the world is here for everyone and there's ways to share it that are just, fair, and equitable. On the other hand, there is the gritty reality that we can only do so much with the resources at hand. Do we welcome the flotilla or do we divert it? Do we even sink it? What shall we do? And while the debate goes on, nothing happens. And the flotilla, slowly makes its way to southern France and arrives on the shores. And suddenly, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people flood into southern France, with the result being a collapse of French society. Oh, well, that was quick, right? I call what's happening in the West now a slow drip version of it. And let's take a look at Dublin, Ireland, and the treatment of Conor McGregor. Or perhaps, the emergence of Viktor Orban in Hungary, or perhaps the new prime minister in the Netherlands, or perhaps the raging debate about immigration in the United States. But to pick the easiest piece right now, let's talk about the events in Ireland over the weekend. 3 individuals stabbed, 2 children and a woman. And the initial press reports were that, a migrant had done this, and the people took to the streets. They'd had enough. No more. Send them home. They chanted, and the streets were ablaze, and there was significant unrest in Dublin, some of the worst rioting in decades. The mainstream media quickly pointed back, no, he was an Irish citizen. He'd been there for about 20 years. Tucker Carlson did an interesting interview with Steve Bannon the other day. It turns out that the Wall Street Journal got it kind of right, but in a misleading sort of way. Yeah, the guy was an Irish citizen. He'd been there for 20 years, 23 to be exact. He arrived in Ireland from Algeria, and he hadn't worked a day in his life, his Irish life. He'd been on the public dole for 23 years. And Bannon notes, and I think the streets of Dublin reflect, that there is a sense in Dublin that the country is being given away to folks who are arriving but aren't contributing. And people who were there and are contributing are getting fed up, pissed off, and angry because they think that their country is being taken from them, that their way of life is slipping between their fingers. And year by year by year, the dark prophecy of Jean Raspail in Camp of the Saints is coming true in Ireland. And every now and then we get episodic flashes of just how dark and dystopian the world can be, aka the stabbing of young children and a mother by a man who's apparently rootless, but put down something like weedy roots within their midst, and they don't want it. And do any of us really? I mean, aren't we all entitled, to our opinions and to our way of life? And is it a crime to fight back to protect yours? Well, in Ireland, apparently it is. Conor McGregor, I think he's 36, 37, 38, world-class mixed martial arts fighter and Irish darling, basically took to Twitter and said, enough, you get what you pay for. We're fighting back. We want our life. And now he's being prosecuted, or at least investigated, and will potentially be prosecuted for a hate crime. And he could face time in prison because what's his crime? Don't give my country away. I want security in my home. I want the settled expectations that I grew up with to be around to hand down to my children. That's a crime. And thus, the new face of populism becomes someone like Conor McGregor. And I would suggest that the unrest in Dublin is a foretaste of what's to come in the United States. We've already talked this fall about events in Chicago and how we said, keep an eye on Chicago and the weather changes in Chicago. What will that teach us about the immigration debate? It's largely fallen off the radar of public consciousness given the events in Israel. But I think before it fell off the radar altogether, we had reports that some migrants were leaving the country saying, the American dream is over. There's nothing here from us for us. It wasn't so bad back home. And I'm not sure that that's not a bad thing. I'm not sure that we don't want the word to go out to the world that we're not an endless resource for everyone to come and enjoy and take advantage of. That there are limits to what we can do. And until we learn to care for the people that are here, until we learn to care for ourselves, it's an unreasonable expectation to suggest that we should be required to care for others. McGregor said that in Ireland, and now he's going to be prosecuted. He's going to be prosecuted under the aegis of new hate speech laws. Plenty of people in the United States want to have those kind of laws here. They call it disinformation. And they don't call it censorship when the government detects it and seeks to eliminate it. They call it, public hygiene. They call it civil discourse. But in the end, somebody has to control the narrative. Somebody has to decide what's acceptable and what's not. And who better to decide what's acceptable in terms of a way of life than people in a community? And you can only push people in a community so far before they react. And I would suggest that the people of Dublin are reacting with violence because they're angry. And they're not angry because the government isn't doing enough for every person who knocks on their door and says, let me in. According Bannon, these statistics, I don't know if they're reliable, but I'm simply reporting at this point. Ireland took in 100,000 people from the Ukraine in the past year. That's a tiny, tiny country, a tiny island, Ireland. What are all these folks doing? And what are they going to do? In the United States under the Biden regime thus far, according to Bannon, and I think I can't remember the resource he relied on. We've had 9 million unlawful immigrants into the United States since January of 2021, that fateful month in American history. If by the time we reach the next inauguration in January of 2025, that number is expected to blossom to as many as 14, potentially 15 million people. Now, some will say we're a country of vast, if not infinite, resources, and we should be able to absorb them. That American history is a tableau of immigrants and migrant waves, one after the other, and that each has left its distinctive mark on the American character. And the result has been this rich and diverse and productive society we call home. Maybe that's a great gamble. And if that's what I have to double down on in order to survive, I'll work it. But I have my doubts whether this is another chapter in the same novel. I think we've turned to a different book. And that book might be the end of American exceptionalism, the end of endless affluence, the end of the ability to harbor the illusion that we can absorb the world's woes, wounded, and poor. I saw an interesting cartoon online over the weekend. You remember the Statue of Liberty there at Ellis Island. Give us your poor, your huddled masses struggling to be free. So words to that effect. I don't have it down exactly. The cartoonist wrote, where does it say, give us all your angry malcontents coming here wanting to wave their own flag and hate America? And it doesn't say that. And, I remind people of the book that no one really talked about in 2020 because we were so busy mourning the death of the fentanyl overdose victim, George Floyd, and burning cities down in mostly peaceful protests, that we never read the book that defines the reality for so much of middle America. And we didn't talk about it enough. I'm talking about Angus Deaton and Ann Case's book, Deaths of Despair. And in it, they chronicle a fact that has become increasingly mainstream. That is, American life expectancy is going down. And it's going down fastest among white working class individuals in middle America who feel a sense of loss of hope, who feel a lack of connection to their community, who feel that there's no place for them to go but out into the next world, whether that be by a suicidal gun to the head, by drinking too much, or by drug abuse. Deaton and Case find objective statistics that these deaths of despair are increasing among a group of people that we increasingly marginalize. because they're white, they ain't right. And in this new era of identity grievances, where everybody suddenly is entitled to a better life, they're entitled to it at the expense of those who what? Who had a life that they didn't earn before, at the expense of others who weren't even here. Um, a lot of dangerous rhetoric in the world right now, and the anti-white rhetoric is particularly disturbing. So keep an eye on the on the Conor McGregor prosecution. Keep an eye on events in Dublin.
Well, and there's not quite yet a prosecution, but he is under criminal investigation, and this is, I guess, this is shed light on the fact that there is a law that Ireland is attempting to pass, and I'm going to put the language there on the screen. And what's going on with Connor is interesting to me, and I was sharing with you this morning some thoughts, Norm, about who Connor is and what he represents to the Western world, sort of that vintage archetype of the stoic man, right? The rags to riches story, the overtly masculine, but also wildly successful and outspoken man. And he, I think a lot of what's being reported are sort of sound bites of what he posted on X. But that's not, it isn't the case that he simply said a few things and likened all of this to this is war and that's it. His expressions were much longer. And if I can, I'll read some of them. I've got the New York Sun as well. I'll go ahead and share the New York Sun article, which I think does an incredible job of weaving this story together. And I'll start here.
Yeah, and folks, here's a plug for the New York Sun, and they're not a sponsor. I wish they were, but it's a good newspaper. You should really be subscribing, because what they'll do is, the events of the day suddenly are portrayed in a somewhat broader lens, a lens that includes perspectives that are normally scorned by publications such as the New York Times and Washington Post. I'm sorry, Mike, I cut you off.
I'm just going to read here briefly. The boxer also rebuked left-wing media members whom an earlier ex-commentator had accused of smearing opponents of mass immigration. Quote, "The absolute picture of weak and feeble," the boxer wrote in a caption to a video of the left-wing reporter. Quote, "One of the most horrific crimes this nation ever seen has occurred. We do not care anymore what you sad cases have got to say." Mr. McGregor went on to compare the current incident to a war. Quote, "In a war, you are nothing. We are not backing down. We are only warming up. There will be no backing down until real change is implemented for the safety of our nation. We are not losing any more of our women and children to sick and twisted people who should not even be in Ireland in the first place. Call it what you want. We do not care. May God help us all. Ireland for victory." And he went on to qualify here, quote, "I do not condone last night's riots. I do not condone any attacks on our first responders in their line of duty. Last night's scenes achieved nothing toward fixing the issues we face. I do understand frustrations, however, and I do understand a move must be made to ensure the change we need is ushered in."
Well, and I think that from a systemic standpoint, when you view a society, um, a well-ordered society doesn't have the wheels popping off the cart, and doesn't have people in the Haymarket with pitchforks and nooses demanding action, demanding change. An angry society is a society that's neglected by its leadership. And Ireland's leadership, as McGregor powerfully points out, is ignoring the ordinary demands of Irish people. And Irish people aren't going to stand for it much longer. And I can't say I blame them.
Well, Don says over on Rumble, "We were too busy trying to destroy Trump to see society crumbling around us. It's still happening." Lawyer Will says, "What about the situation in France as well?" Don says, "All of Europe is reacting except the elites."
Oh, I don't really want to hear from Dawn, because Dawn's going to be under investigation soon by the Law and Legitimacy Football Commission for excessive points last night. She managed to score 180 some points in a victory over Mike's team, which had 160, which is normally enough to lead. So Dawn, lawyer up. Joe Petiti, we're hiring Joe Petiti to conduct an investigation of sign stealing or something, because getting 180 points one night in fantasy football is just uncalled for. But I know you guys who don't like sports hate it when Mike and I pivot that way. So let's get away from that. Quick legal update about McGregor, Ireland, what's going on, dissent, and crushing it. I finally received a letter from Owen Shroyer last night that he'd sent a couple weeks ago. It arrived yesterday in my firm's mail in New Haven. It was emailed up to me, and I read it last night. Owen is well. He's able to continue to read letters that the DOC gives him, and he's acquired a number of books. But he does relay that one consequence of his quote unquote punishment for speaking out while in prison will be that he is not going to be permitted to use internet or much of the phone, frankly, until he is released from confinement. And I can confirm, at least based on what Owen has written me, that what he was accused of was a violation of unstated prison communication policies. He spoke to a friend on the phone. The friend recorded what Owen said, and then the person broadcast that recording to the world at large. Owen had a hearing only, but it was 2 weeks after the alleged event. And it was announced that his punishment was basically to be held incommunicado for the rest of his confinement. Owen will do the time, and he's in good spirits, and he thanks everybody for their continued support and urges you to continue to write, saying he reads, and this was in uppercase letters, each and every letter. They help him pass the time. But, Owen will soon be home. Probably within 3 weeks. His estimated release date, according to the Bureau of Prisons page online, is December 18th. I think they'll recalculate release dates at the end of this month. It wouldn't surprise me to see him out by the 14th or 15th. But there are long-termers who are suffering as well, and suffering in ways that I think are a little bit more chilling and frightening. A quick update on Joe Biggs. He's one of the Proud Boys. You'll recall I represented him in the seditious conspiracy trial earlier in the year. He's been sentenced, I believe, to 14 years or thereabouts. I can't recall the exact number. He's been called in now for weekly debriefing by prison officials. They want to know who he's communicating with, who the sources of financial support are, and this is surprising to me. Joe's been convicted. He's been sentenced. He's doing his time. He has supporters in the world at large, including those of you here who contribute to his various pages. It's none of the Bureau of Prisons' business who his contributors are. It's none of their business who supports him, unless their intention is to isolate and break him and to make sure that he becomes an atom floating in a sea of despair, as opposed to part of a larger organism that is a people united in its desire to see a better community. Joe Biggs and the Proud Boys were prosecuted, in my view, because they were Western chauvinists, because their first tenet of their belief is that they're proud of Western civilization and they refuse to apologize for creation of the Western world. There was no evidence that they planned an insurrection. There was no evidence that they planned sedition. It was a riot gone bad and out of hand. But now that they're convicted, the Justice Department and the Bureau of Prisons seems intent on breaking their will in the same way that the Irish government seems intent on breaking Conor McGregor's will. I won't go as far as Tucker goes and suggest that there's a great replacement theory out there, but I will say that something fundamental is at stake. And at least from an American perspective, what's fundamental is the right to speak out. And what's at stake is our traditional view of the First Amendment. And so there'll be many legal fights to come. I want to shift off of Owen and
Speaking of Will, lawyer Will,
right.
in the chat follows up on the French issue. Lawyer Will says a French teen was killed by North African immigrants. There were protests, and France is reacting by moving to shut down, quote, far right groups. So I told Will that we will look into that further. But that is an interesting development, separate and apart from Ireland.
And to me, it's a false flag. It's a false move. If there's violence in a community and the community reacts, do you stigmatize the community as being far right? How about a government that stigmatizes its community for seeking to defend itself as being stigmatized as far left or globalist or out of touch? And hence the appeal of populism. The appeal of populism is this is where I live. And God damn it, I care about it. And I'm going to fight to maintain it no matter what you, Uncle Sam, or, Perot, or whatever the good French equivalent has to say about it. And if the streets are going to get violent, well, they're going to get violent because there have been insurrections and whatnot in world history, and there have been efforts to replace regimes that were unresponsive, and there can be again. But hey, let's pivot. Mike, this is, you're going to be on the I told you so toot for a bit. So let me retreat into the background and tell everybody about how prophetic you were and how the unsealed complaint with respect to Meta proves a point that you've been trying to get me to hear and that we still have to debate.
Yeah, we've got quite a ways to go. And so I'll put the unredacted complaint here on the page just because, unlike any of the other media outlets reporting on this anywhere, even the accounts online that claim to be attempting to help bring this information to the public, the least you can do is give a case citation and direct people to set up their own Pacer account if they want to. Or here's a novel idea: when you spend the $2.30 to download the 233-page unredacted complaint, maybe just make that available for download to the people that read your stuff. It's not a crazy idea. So for everybody here, the case number in the Northern District of California is 423 CV as in civil 05448 YGR. And so if you want to look up this case of the state's attorneys general versus Meta, you can certainly do that. And what I have on the screen here is probably the 77th entry in the Pacer history. So all the documents and filings organized chronologically. And you will see that on November the 22nd, the court allowed the state's attorneys general to file an unredacted version of the original complaint that Norm and I briefly covered in October, late in October. And the basis of this complaint is various violations of federal regulatory scheme. So think of COPPA, C-O-P-P-A, sort of the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, sort of reporting and the mechanisms that these big social media companies should be deploying to ensure that underage users, those under 13, aren't accessing the platform, et cetera. However, just to get back to what Norm was attempting to lob to me for the Vince Carter style alley-oop, is the fact that Wall Street Journal has now reported on the fact that Meta is designing products intentionally to, quote, capitalize on teen vulnerabilities, aka Meta understands that speech is not the core issue of its market share and its presumptive monopoly in the online space via Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc. That in fact it is using the undeveloped minds as a platform to condition public approval for certain things that it deems worthy, and obviously it's to sell ads. That's the primary profit motive, and the margins for Facebook and Meta are extraordinarily large. But Norm, this is more to the point that I believe Vivek Ramaswamy, when he said you must be a certain age to access these platforms, et cetera. These are the things, the appeal to the dopamine receptors, the appeal to the mental state of young people, the increased detachment and disassociation going on with young people, the fact that these algorithms are engineered in such a way as to shock them into continuing to scroll or continuing to consume content that they themselves might not even understand. What we're realizing through this lawsuit isn't necessarily where I want this lawsuit to go. I think I said this late in October when we covered this story, that I wasn't totally convinced that the state's attorneys generals are the proper plaintiffs or the petitioners in this action, that they're seeking injunctive relief, right, for enforcement of certain existing federal guidelines, et cetera. But it is a step in the right direction, I believe.
So I want to focus on the neurobiology here, because, rather than the political content, because this is, Mike and I, regular listeners will know that Mike and I are at cross purposes on this issue. I think I don't want to put words into Mike's mouth, but as I understand him, he seems to believe that there is a valid role for government to regulate access to social media with age restrictions, similar to the way we regulate access to cigarettes, alcohol, or the ability to drive. And the theory being that there's something about social media that has the potential to do profound harm to young people. I've pushed back by saying, well, that may be, but social media is the vehicle through which people acquire ideas, and giving the government the ability to tap down on the basis of content presents profound First Amendment issues, and isn't the family the right repository for that? the redacted portions of the suit, and a redaction, by the way, is just an edit. So when those of you who aren't lawyers and read legal documents online will sometimes be frustrated to see black boxes put through stuff just when things got interesting. Those are redactions. And so now in the district court, some 77 pleadings or marginal notations into the case, the court said, okay, fine, let the public know what's going on. And what we learn, is that in Meta, those who study the communication devices at disposal of Meta are well aware of the fact that the adolescent mind is susceptible to pleasure points, pressure and pleasure points. I chose that word deliberately. In response to a positive reinforcement, the brain or the nervous system will release a little piece of dopamine, a pleasure-inducing thing. And so the Facebook or Meta has investigated the extent to which young people will respond almost like lab rats to dopamine, and that dopamine can hook them on their own pleasure points. And these pleasure points can be reinforced by Meta, thus creating an even tighter grip of Meta on these young minds. And that unlike we allegedly and supposedly more mature people of advanced years, they won't be able to say no to the dopamine. That changes the argument, and it tips the balance in Mike's favor, because it better reflects the medical analogy that has emerged in our debate over time. Nicotine is addictive. Alcohol can be addictive. Driving requires cognitive skills that I don't know, that are obviously related to physiological maturity, but it's not as near a fit. But focusing on nicotine and alcohol, I think the argument will be that Meta, when used appropriately by people with the judgment who can, as Nancy Reagan once famously said, just say no, can be a useful means of purveying content. But if you lack the ability to discern, it becomes an end in itself. And it gives to those peddling the content an undue influence over young minds, and it might warp the development of those young minds. And if Meta's doing this because it knows it can hook individuals on dopamine, a self-induced narcotic state, as it were, and make enormous profits from that, isn't there something fundamentally wrong with that? I mean, that's the claim, I think, Mike, as I'm understanding it. Now, of course, Meta's spokesman says in a piece, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, oh no, we're simply we're simply researching their vulnerabilities. Well, yeah, I'm reminded of the classic Alexandra Nadapoff book, which basically opened my eyes to the dangers and ills of social media. And it was called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And her thesis was simply this, that we get access to free internet service, not because the internet providers are such wonderful human beings, but because they're studying us and they're collecting data on this, and they're collecting data on us that lets them predict our behavior. And by giving them this kind of data, especially as big data becomes bigger and bigger, Nadapoff's book is now 5 or 6 years old. Things have gotten that much more amazing in that brief period of time. It gives them the ability to control us, as it were. And so they're getting a direct access into the next generation of Americans by learning how to control and manipulate their minds. Then we move from this biological substrate to the ideological perspective, and that's the TikTok problem that I think Mike has been talking about, where suddenly you've got a foreign entity controlling our pleasure points, the pleasure points of young people, what they're reacting to and what they're not. And so suddenly we've got this generation of pro-Hamas zombies, forgetting for the moment the rape, pillage, and plunder of grandmothers and children, and focusing only on the TikTok message, free Palestine, as though Palestine were ever a state and as though it's now being held hostage. So, Mike, I just wanted to summarize the debate. I'm not sure where we go from here in the litigation. They're powerful allegations, though.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring up the table of contents from the complaint just for people to, and for you as well, Norm, to see the allegations that are being made. Right. And paragraph 8 here says Meta schemed, or section 8 here says Meta schemed to exploit young users for profit. That's the broad heading. Subparagraph A, to maximize profit, Meta's business model focuses on increasing young users' engagement. Meta monetizes young users' attention through data harvesting and targeted advertising. So there's the old adage, Norm. If the product or service is free, it's because you are the product. Meta specifically targets young users. Meta designs and deploys features to capture young users' attention and prolong their time on its social media platforms. Subparagraph B, Meta falsely represents that its social media platform features are safe and not designed to induce young users' compulsive and extended use. This is where it gets interesting and more along the lines of the cognitive science that I was ultimately, and I hope you can understand, Norm, why I'm reluctant to simply saying it's neurobiology, it's cognitive science. I'm not the subject matter expert in these fields. I can intuit that this is most certainly an issue related to addiction, and the addiction is an essence of the mind, right? But what I can't say is what these experts and these surveys and these studies and the data that's being discovered by and through this lawsuit, the emails being exchanged between the executive team leaders, including the founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, right? That he is prioritizing percentage points of profit over the implementation and the maintenance of these safety protocols and things that have been brought to his attention. And let's not forget that Facebook is just one thing. Younger people are on these more visually inclined apps like Instagram and TikTok, which grab attention. And in the Rumble chat, we have references to brainwashing, right? Which is not off base. And I think that is where I am able to see in my mind an obvious connection between the conflict that we are experiencing here in our country as between the Israel-Palestine conflict, the war in Gaza, exactly what you were just talking about. But that is where I'm beginning to understand a very broad and easily understood consequence to the term NPC, right? We've talked about that before, the non-playable character. You've asked me, what is an NPC? A non-playable character is from video games, right? They are people that are just computer-driven instruments that are within your experience playing an online game, that all of their animations and behavior and their interactions are pre-programmed. They have no sentience. They're just there occupying space. That is what these algorithms are doing in mass to young people, right? That they are depriving them of any space for real cognitive development and critical thinking. And instead, they are programming certain opinions based on what is socially acceptable and what is from a top-down sort of authoritarian perspective, the truth, as it were, right?
Well, so but now we get back to the regulatory question: what to do about it? I mean, because if we have government say, that social media is like nicotine, you can't smoke it until you reach a certain age, then you're going to have an enforcement mechanism. And a blanket restriction on social media seems unreasonable in my mind, especially given how education uses the internet, and we expose young people to computers. I mean, are we going to put screens on computer or filters on computers in schools and say that?
Yeah, they already do that. Norm, I was working on a tablet PC as a 16-year-old with school-wide intranet, with school-wide email, and very limited access to outside
17
sources.
years ago. I think the world has changed a great deal since then.
Well, in terms of firewalls
Who
and
regulates the regulators? That's the age-old question about any regulation of content. And so, I hear you.
I understand. Look, I love the idea that education has been democratized by virtue of the proliferation of the internet. I love that. I do, and I'm a firm believer right now that education, as it has historically been known, has long left the academy. Right, that what is happening on American university campuses, by and large, is not learning, and it's not teaching, and it's not education. It is a capital E education based on the economic model thereof, but it is not in any way, shape, or form, and should not be confused for learning and in real world application of skills and development of talent stacks, as Scott Adams would call it.
Well, all right. Look, so we kind of rounded that third base, and we're heading for home on that topic. Let's keep an eye on this litigation. The way civil litigation typically unfolds is once the issues are joined in pleadings, and now we've had an unredacted complaint. In other words, the public at large can see what's at stake. The defendants will now have a chance to respond. They'll either answer or file motions to dismiss. And a motion to dismiss would be to say to the court that even if everything that they've alleged is true, it doesn't amount to a violation of the law. I suspect there will be motions to dismiss filed here. I suspect there will be a lot of discovery conducted. And I suspect that discovery, a lot of it will be out of public view because Meta and Facebook will claim that there are trade secrets that they need to disclose from the public at large. So I assume that out there in Listenerville, if not here, in the internet at large, there is an Edward Snowden or a Julian Assange, a whistleblower who has access to this information and will provide it to the public at large. Julian, Edward, whatever your name is, if you want to bring it to someplace, bring it to us. We'll listen, we'll broadcast. Because I do think that the shape of the world to come is largely going to be digital. And what our digital overlords are doing is a vital issue of public concern, and we ought to pay as much attention to it as we possibly can. Quick update, and then I guess we'll wrap it up for the day. We've talked before about the role of ChatGPT and it doing legal research for lawyers. We followed the case in New York of a lawyer who asked ChatGPT to do a brief for him, and when the brief was written, come to find out it cited cases that didn't exist. He got a slap on the wrist. Well, a Colorado judge sees things differently. A Colorado attorney has been suspended from the practice of law. I'm not sure for how long. But his crime was using ChatGPT to do his legal research in violation of his duty, basically of candor toward the tribunal and to exercise diligence on behalf of his clients. You can't let a machine do your thinking for you. And I think that's Mike's larger point about the outsourcing of education. It used to be that universities were places that young people went for the formation of their minds. Now those minds are largely formed before they get to a university, and they're formed by these ubiquitous machines that feed us data we don't understand. In the case of Mr. Attorney or former attorney or now suspended attorney Crabbill, a 29-year-old Colorado fellow, he'll sit out for a year. And he'll sit out for a year to learn a valuable lesson. And the lesson is that the law is experience applied to the reality of the interests that clients present to you. Your job as a lawyer is to discover the law, not to be spoon-fed something from an algorithm you don't understand, and not to transform what you're spoon-fed to someone else as though it is authoritative. We have to take back the world from the digital entities that seek to control it and make it ours. Attorney Crabbill, you learned a powerful lesson here. Lawyers watching, take note. Lawyer Will. I don't know if you and Pete still compete for points on mentions on the show, but I wanted to say welcome back. I've missed you. Tell Pete we're watching Merry Beggars with interest and congratulate him on a job well done.
Well, and one thing that is, and I echo your thoughts there, Norm. What up, Will? And we need to get your brother back into the chat a little bit here. I know he's busy man.
Will. Athena says hello. Athena, say hi to Lawyer Will. She just get out and play in the snow. That's all. She's hounding me here.
Overlooked aspect of this reporting on the Zachariah Crabbill suspension and probation. Norm, I've got on the screen here the order, as it were, and in relevant part it says that before a hearing on the motion, Crabbill discovered that the cases from ChatGPT were either incorrect or fictitious. Discovered, right? Yeah. But Crabbill did not alert the court to the sham cases at the hearing, nor did he withdraw the motion. Here's where it gets interesting, Norm. When the judge expressed concerns about the accuracy of the cases, Crabbill falsely attributed the mistakes to a legal intern.
Yeah.
6 days after the hearing, Crabbill filed an affidavit with the court explaining that he used ChatGPT when he drafted the motion. This guy's 29 years old and has a really faulty relationship with the truth. That's the issue here. And it's a shoddy work ethic. It's unrealized expectations of the practice of law. And it is the fact that he's got a less than desirable relationship with the truth. And that's why he should be suspended for a year. ChatGPT is a separate issue. But Norm, as you say all the time, you have an absolute duty of candor toward the tribunal. Saying that something is a result of your legal intern's work is undignified at best in front of a judge, right? That work was submitted that you didn't yourself look over and vet. But to use some sort of excuse to hide the fact that you didn't do real work and tried to pass it off as something legitimate. What if, Norm, the court did not realize what had gone on here? And what if the motion had been granted? And what if the counterparty's rights had been prejudiced materially because this guy was willing to just outsource his work as a practitioner to a computer that is making up case law. What does that do to the system of justice in the United States? This should be, in my opinion, more than a year of suspension from practice. I think this is a disqualifying infraction, to be honest with you.
It gives control. If permitted, you may be right. If permitted to stand, this kind of behavior is, in a sense, yielding to the algorithm control of reality. Because if litigation is anything, it is a contest between parties with differing versions of what's true, often, and differing versions of what law apply, and different versions of what the just outcome will be. If we sacrifice our ability to do that to machines and we let the machines sort it out, we will have a world in which we don't have any control. There is no substitute for the human factor in litigation. And as those of you who operate small firms are learning, perhaps daily, take it from a guy who's been doing it for many years. In a small firm, feces flow uphill. When there's a problem in your shop, it's always your problem.
That's
You can't
absolutely right.
pop it off to the guy below you. They're your responsibility. So, tough lesson for Mr. Crabbill. I hate to see somebody knocked out of the law forever. I understand your anger at him, Mike. Let's hope he learns a lesson. We talk about it as a cautionary tale for young lawyers out there. Hey, the practice of law is tough. There's an infinite amount of work and only a finite number of hours to get it done. And everybody's looking for an edge and a cost saving one at that. But farming out the work, your legal research and your determination of what cases apply is something you can't yield to a machine. It can't be done. And if you do it, maybe you should sacrifice the ability to practice law.
Absolutely. And consider this. In a world in which hearings are no longer required to be in person, something that you've talked about a lot, one must be willing to just still do the literal work. Because if you're not going to be in person in front of the tribunal and you're not going to do the actual work, well, Norm, what the fuck are you?
Well, Athena's talked. She heard you say the word work. And if there's one thing that a border collie understands, it's work. Athena, shall we go out and work in the snow? You want to go out and walk? Shall we go out and walk? We're heading out. Thanks, folks.
See y'all tomorrow.
Mike, where do people find us?
YouTube, Rumble Live, at LawPod Daily, X, follow us at LawPod Daily, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Overcast, Audible, wherever premium podcasts are found. Norm, I will see you tomorrow, my man. And I'm not done with this rant. I'll probably continue this rant tomorrow morning.
Which rant is that?
On the ethical considerations of submitting a brief to the court made up of precedent that doesn't exist.
Well, now that you talk about it, I think that to the degree we tolerate it, we begin to replace lawyers with machines. And most people view lawyers as little more than machines. They don't understand what we're talking about. And maybe they don't care. As long as they get predictable results, plug it into the algorithm, and let the computer tell us what's just. Are we going to sacrifice everything that all of our dignity, all of our autonomy to machines? Some people say, yeah, why not? As long as we're feeling safe, secure, fat, and happy, let somebody else do our thinking for us. Hell no, we won't go. That's what Mike is saying, and I agree with him.
That's right. See you tomorrow morning, Norm. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for everybody in the Rumble chat, as well as on YouTube, but where Rumble is, where everybody gets it popping. So thank you guys for being here. Love you very much. Appreciate your support. Make sure you've put a thumbs up on this video. You're sharing around. Enable notifications and all that kind of stuff. Norm, I'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao.